What caused the nuclear accident at Chernobyl?
The April 1986 accident, the world's worst nuclear power plant disaster, was caused by explosions at the Soviet power plant, sending radioactive clouds across much of northern Europe. According to the World Nuclear Association, the accident was the result of a flawed reactor design that was operated with inadequately trained personnel and without proper regard for safety. The trouble began at 1:24 a.m. on Saturday, April 26, when Unit 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, about 70 miles outside of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, was rocked by two enormous explosions. The roof was blown off the plant and radioactive gases and materials were sent more than a half-mile into the atmosphere. Though two workers were killed instantly, there was no official announcement about the hazardous blast. It was the Swedes who detected a dramatic increase in windborne radiation. And on April 28, 2 full days after the accident, news of the event was briefly reported by the Soviet news agency TASS. 2 weeks later, on May 14, First Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, 1931, went on national television and explained what officials knew about the accident. More details were revealed over the following months. The explosions were caused by an unauthorized test carried out by plant operators who were trying to determine what would happen in the event of a power outage. There were 6 critical errors made by workers during the testing, which combined to spell disaster. Perhaps the most significant of these mistakes was turning off the emergency coolant system. Once the test was underway, further mistakes caused the core to heat to more than 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit, producing molten metal that reacted with wet cooling. Water was left to produce hydrogen gas and steam, resulting in a powerful explosion. What caused the second explosion is not clear, and experts disagree on what might have happened. Some theorize that it was a pure nuclear reaction.
What does the letter X in Malcolm X's name stand for?
The influential but controversial African American leader, who was a staunch defendant of black rights, took the surname X in 1952, upon his release from prison. He explained that the letter stood for the unknown African name of his ancestors. Malcolm X's family's name, Little, was that given to his slave ancestors by their owner. By adopting X as his surname, it was at once a bitter reminder of his family's slavery and an affirmation of his unknown African roots.
How were Southern blacks prevented from voting?
Besides intimidation, there were 3 different methods used in southern states in the early part of the century to disenfranchise black citizens: 1. The poll tax, 2. Literacy tests, and 3. Grandfather clauses. The poll tax required a voter to pay a fee in order to exercise the right to vote. Literacy tests were implemented as a prerequisite for voting. This method also kept many poorly educated whites, unable to pass the exam, from casting their ballots as well. Most southern states also adopted legislation by which voting rights were extended only to those citizens who had been able to vote as of a certain date, a date when few if any black men would have been able to vote. Since these laws made provisions for said voters' descendants as well, they were dubbed grandfather clauses. Such attempts to deny citizens the right to vote were made unlawful in 1964, by the 24th Amendment, which outlaws the poll tax in all federal elections and primaries. In 1965, by the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed measures used to suppress minority votes. And in 1966, when poll taxes at the state and local levels were also declared illegal. Literacy tests and grandfather clauses were also struck down as unconstitutional.
Is it true that the engineers of the Challenger's O-rings warned NASA that the devices might fail?
Yes, but sadly the advice of the engineers went unheeded. The O-ring manufacturer, Morton Thiokol, gave the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, the go-ahead in the hours before Challenger's takeoff. On January 27, 1986, the night before the planned takeoff, the temperature at Cape Canaveral, Florida, dropped to well below freezing. Since no shuttle had been launched in temperatures below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, NASA undertook a late-night review to determine launch readiness. As a contractor, Morton Thiokol participated in this process, with their engineers expressing concerns about the O-rings on the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. They feared the rings would stiffen in the cold temperatures and lose their ability to act as a seal. Since the space agency was under pressure to launch the shuttle on schedule, NASA managers pushed the manufacturer for a go or no-go decision. The managers of Thiokol, who were aware that the O-rings had never been tested at such low temperatures, signed a waiver stating that the solid rocket boosters were safe for launch at the colder temperatures. Challenger was launched the next morning, at 11:38 a.m. About 1 minute into the flight, a flame became evident, and seconds later, the spacecraft exploded. All 7 crew members died. Investigators later concluded that the tragic accident had been caused by the failure of the O-rings.
What was the Dust Bowl?
The Dust Bowl was the most severe drought in U.S. history. In the spring of 1934, the country in the grips of the Great Depression. Farmers across the Great Plains of the United States witnessed 2 great dust storms. First, in mid-April, after days of hot, dry weather and cloudless skies, 40 to 50 mile-per-hour winds picked up and took with them the dry soil, resulting in thick, Heavy clouds. In Texas and Oklahoma, these dirt clouds engulfed the landscape. The next month was extremely hot. And on May 10 the second storm came up as the gales returned, this time creating a light brown fog. On May 11 experts estimated that 12 million tons of soil fell on Chicago as the dust storm blew in off the Great Plains. And the same storm darkened the skies over Cleveland. On May 12 the dust clouds had reached the eastern seaboard. Between the two storms, 650 million tons of topsoil had blown off the plains. The resulting dust bowl covered 300,000 square miles across New Mexico, eastern Colorado, Texas, western Oklahoma, and Kansas. The damage was great. Crops, principally wheat, were cut off at ground level or torn from their roots. Cattle that ate dust-laden grass eventually died from mud balls. Dust drifted, creating banks against barns and houses. While families tried to keep it from penetrating the cracks and crevices of their homes by using wet blankets, oiled cloths, and tape, only to still have everything covered in grit. Vehicles and machinery were clogged with dirt. In addition to the farmers who died in the fields. Suffocated by the storm, hundreds of people suffered from dust pneumonia.
What was the temperance movement?
Temperance was an American movement that began in the mid-1800s to outlaw the manufacture and consumption of alcoholic beverages, which were viewed by many to be a corrupt influence on American family life. By 1855, growing public support to ban liquor resulted in 31 states making it illegal to some degree. But a national policy of temperance was still sought by many. During the 1870s, temperance became one of the cornerstones of the growing women's movement. As the nation's women, joined by other activists, mobilized to gain suffrage, the right to vote, they also espoused sweeping cultural changes. In 1874, a group of women established the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. In 1895, the Anti-Saloon League was formed. Such societies, which grew out of a fundamentalist spirit, found an increasing voice and eventually influenced legislators, many of whom were dry candidates that the societies had supported, to take federal action. Even President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, supported prohibition as one of the domestic policies of his New Freedom program. The movement met with success in January 16, 1919, when the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, 1788, was ratified, forbidding people to make, sell, or transport intoxicating liquors in the United States and in all territories within its jurisdiction. Though Congress, which proposed the amendment on December 18, 1917, provided states with a period of 7 years in which to ratify the amendment, it took just over a year for it to be approved. Such was the prevailing spirit among lawmakers. After the amendment was made, Congress passed the Volstead Act to enforce it. But government nevertheless found prohibition difficult to enforce. Bootleggers, who made their own moonshine illegal spirits, often distilled at night. Rum runners, who imported liquor, principally from neighboring Canada and Mexico. And speakeasies, underground establishments that sold liquor to their clientele, proliferated. Soon organized crime ran the distribution of liquor in the country, whose citizens had not lost their taste for alcoholic beverages. The government now found itself with a bigger problem. As the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and police worked to control and end mob violence. And as the country suffered through the early years of the Great Depression, lawmakers in Washington reconsidered the amendment. On February 20, 1933, the U.S. Congress proposed that the 18th Amendment be repealed. Approved by the states in December of that year, the 21st Amendment declared the 18th Amendment null. And the manufacture, transportation, and consumption of alcoholic beverages was again legal in the United States, ending the 13-year period of prohibition. Herbert Hoover, 1874 to 1964, president at the time of repeal, called prohibition a noble experiment.
What was the worst industrial accident?
It was the gas leak at a Union Carbide chemical plant in Bhopal, India, on December 3, 1984. At about 12:30 a.m., methyl isocyanate, MIC, a deadly gas, began escaping from the pesticide plant. And it spread southward, eventually covering approximately 15 square miles. Within a few hours, thousands of Bhopal residents were affected by the asphyxiating gas. General symptoms included severe chest congestion, vomiting, paralysis, sore throat, chills, coma, fever, swelling of legs, impaired vision, and palpitations. Estimates of the total death toll range from the official government estimate between 3,000 and 10,000. A figure based on what medical professionals described. In total, 200,000 people were directly or indirectly affected by the poisonous gas. Within hours of the accident, Bhopal police moved into action, closing the plant and arresting its manager and 4 of his assistants. The 5 men were charged with culpable homicide through negligence. Union Carbide dispatched a team of technical experts from its Danbury, Connecticut headquarters, but upon arrival at the plant, they were turned away by local authorities. Meanwhile, the Indian Central Bureau of Investigation seized the plant's records and logbooks and ordered an inquiry into the accident. Union Carbide's chief executive officer Warren M. Anderson flew to Bhopal, but he was promptly arrested, along with 2 officials of the company's Indian subsidiary. The corporate executives were charged with 7 offenses including criminal conspiracy, culpable homicide not amounting to murder, making the atmosphere noxious to health, and causing death by negligence. Anderson was later released on bond. Upon learning of the horrific accident, U.S. President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, sent a message conveying the grief shared by him and the American people. Multinational corporations, including Union Carbide, were vilified in the press. The Soviet news agency accused such companies of marketing low-quality products and outdated technology to developing countries. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, 1944 to 1991, of India visited the disaster site and announced immediate creation of a $4 million relief fund for victims. He also vowed that he would prevent multinational corporations from setting up dangerous factories in India. The implications of the industrial accident were many. It prompted public scrutiny of safety systems at chemical plants around the globe. Given the number of plants where poisonous chemicals are produced and stored, some observers believe chemical accidents could happen as often as once in every 10 years. Union Carbide, of course, suffered financially. The stock dropped more than 12 points, wiping out 27%, or almost $1 billion, of its market value, in about 1 week. Damage claims were filed in behalf of the victims, with noted American criminal attorney Melvin Belli filing one of them in the amount of $15 billion. In addition to the thousands who died in Bhopal, others suffered from long-term effects including chronic lesions of the eyes, permanent scarring of the lungs, and injuries to the liver, brain, heart, kidneys, and the immune system. In the years after the accident, studies showed that the rate of spontaneous abortions and infant deaths in Bhopal were 3 to 4 times the regional rate.
What was the Johnstown flood?
The city of Johnstown, in southwest Pennsylvania, east of Pittsburgh, has been the site of numerous floods, but the most disastrous one occurred on May 31, 1889, when the South Fork Dam on the Conemaugh River gave way, releasing a torrent of water. Since the dam was located some 14 miles into the Allegheny Mountains, the waters rushed into Johnstown at a rate of 50 miles per hour. The water hit with a force strong enough to have tossed a 48-ton locomotive 1 mile. It killed more than 2,000 people, some sources place the estimate as high as 5,000 lives lost. At the time of the flood, the city's population was about 30,000. Meaning between 6 and 16% of the population died as a result of the disaster. In 1977, Johnstown was again the site of a disastrous flood. Though advance warning systems helped minimize the loss of life to 77.
What impact did Love Canal have?
The effect of the crisis was felt on many levels, by area residents whose lives were forever changed by the hazards. by residents nearby Love Canal who feared for their own safety, by Americans across the country who lived near other chemical waste sites, and by Americans for whom Love Canal had become synonymous with the problems posed by hazardous waste. At the government level, the tragic events at Love Canal helped to speed the passage of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, also known as the Superfund. The legislation set up a multi-billion-dollar fund to clean up the nation's worst toxic disasters. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, assigned cleanup priority to some 200 abandoned and potentially contaminated waste sites. Along with the chemical plant explosion at Bhopal, India, in 1984, Love Canal also contributed to a community right to know provision, which was part of the 1985 Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. The new legislation gave all citizens the right to know what chemicals are produced, stored, or buried in their neighborhoods.
What was the worst hurricane in U.S. history?
Hurricane Katrina, which hit the Gulf Coast in late August 2005, was not only the most disastrous hurricane in U.S. history, it was the nation's worst single weather disaster. Though not the strongest possible hurricane when it made landfall, Katrina had weakened from a Category 5 storm to a Category 4 storm just before it struck the Gulf Coast. Katrina was a monster. The storm stretched about 200 miles in diameter, packed winds up to 145 miles per hour, produced torrential rain and huge waves, spawned twisters throughout the region, and pushed up a 28-foot storm surge, a surge usually found only in Category 5 hurricanes. Katrina moved ashore on the Gulf Coast on Monday, August 29. In anticipation of the hurricane, New Orleans, which sits below sea level, had been evacuated. But there were still tens of thousands who stayed out of necessity, such as law enforcement and healthcare workers. Because they were unable to evacuate, or because they chose not to leave, some 23,000 of those who stayed holed up in the aging Superdome Sports Arena, which was set up as an emergency shelter. The structure barely withstood the lashing winds of Katrina, which blew off portions of the dome. On Tuesday morning, after Katrina ravaged Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, before weakening as it moved inland, officials and news reporters generally agreed that there was unbelievable damage all along the coast. But New Orleans had dodged a bullet. The Big Easy had not taken the worst of it. Gulfport and Biloxi, Mississippi, appeared the hardest hit. The devastation there was astonishing. As reports of damage began to be made, it became clear that about 90% of the structures along the Gulf Coast were destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people were displaced by Katrina. The death toll was not known, and officials conceded it would take time to determine. The storm had been so ruinous of biblical proportions. Some said that rescue and recovery would take weeks and months. Later, when the full extent of damage began to be discovered, the recovery estimates were revised to years. Later Tuesday, New Orleans' fate changed. Levees that protect the city could not hold back a swollen Lake Pontchartrain. 80% of the city filled with water, 25 feet deep. Officials and volunteers could not get flood victims out fast enough, usually plucking them from rooftops or finding them in attics, where survivors sought refuge as waters rose. The city descended into chaos and lawlessness. Heart-wrenching images of human despair filled the media, touching people around the nation. Americans responded with donations of money, goods, and time. The American Red Cross launched the largest mobilization effort in its history. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, a part of the Department of Homeland Security (DHS). The Coast Guard, also part of the DHS, and the U.S. military struggled to keep pace with Katrina's aftermath all along the coast. For all the effort, it was widely acknowledged that the government's response to the disaster was inadequate and late. On Friday, September 2, President George W. Bush said that the results had been unacceptable. He further promised to make it right. While politicians and the people spoke out on the subject, some experts said the catastrophe had simply overwhelmed the system. Emergency programs across the nation had been set up to rely on local and state response first, backed by the federal government. In Katrina's case, the devastation was so great that the localities and states either were not able to respond at all or could not respond with enough help. Federal intervention had been needed sooner and in greater measure to alleviate human suffering and protect lives. Government officials all seemed of one accord. However, the fact-finding could wait, the victims could not. Cities and states across the nation sent resources to the Gulf Coast and set up emergency centers to receive storm refugees, whose needs were immediate: water, food, clothing, shelter, medicine, healthcare, and counseling, and long-term, jobs, schools, and permanent housing. On Wednesday, September 7, 9 days after Katrina struck, the situation continued to unfold. The size and scope of the tragedy remained to be fully understood. New Orleans ordered a forced evacuation of the holdouts. The city remained flooded with toxic floodwaters as repairs were made in the levees and the hazardous water began to be pumped out. Efforts to reunite families, separated in the chaos, were ongoing. For many days, rescue workers all along the Gulf Coast had moved from house to find survivors. Now it was a matter of trying to identify and count the dead. The death toll was expected to be in the thousands. The affected area was 90,000 square miles, or about the size of Minnesota. Property damage was projected to be at least $26 billion in insured losses and perhaps twice that amount in uninsured losses. Katrina had also caused damages as it struck Florida as a Category 1 hurricane on August 26. It later moved into the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico and strengthened before striking the Gulf Coast. Katrina's aftermath was felt in every state of the Union. Volunteers shored up efforts to assist survivors who were being relocated in an effort to ease the burden on the afflicted region. Schools across the nation opened doors to displaced students. Fuel prices skyrocketed and natural gas and heating oil prices promised to follow, as offshore rigs and Gulf Coast refineries suffered. And most Americans worried about the government's response to the catastrophe. The disaster made an impact around the world as well, with some 95 countries offering assistance. Before Katrina, the deadliest hurricane to strike the United States was an unnamed Category 4 storm that struck Galveston, Texas, in 1900. The September 8 storm claimed at least 8,000 lives. Some estimates place the number as high as 12,000. Hurricane strength is measured on the Saffir-Simpson scale, where Category 1 is the weakest. With sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour and a storm surge of 4 to 5 feet above normal, and Category 5 is the strongest. With sustained winds of more than 155 miles per hour and a storm surge higher than 18 feet. The United States has been hit by 3 Category 5 storms since record-keeping began. The first was a Labor Day hurricane, which struck the Florida Keys in 1935, 408 people died. The second was Camille, which hit Mississippi and southeast Louisiana in 1969, claiming 256 lives. Hurricane Andrew, which struck South Miami-Dade County, Florida. In late August 1992, was measured as a Category 4 storm at the time, but the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency NOAA reclassified it in 2002 as a Category 5 storm. Andrew claimed more than 100 lives and devastated a wide area, mostly around the town of Homestead, Florida.
What was the impact of the disaster at Chernobyl?
As the worst nuclear power plant disaster to date, the Chernobyl accident in 1986 had far-reaching effects. Total fallout from the accident eventually reached a level 10 times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Japan, on August 6, 1945, at the end of World War II, 1939–45. Some 30 firefighters and plant workers died just after the accident. Plants and animals in the immediate area and downwind of the plant were heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout. More than 10 years after the accident, food crops still could not be planted in the region. The immediate after-effects were felt in Europe as well. Some Italian vegetables were found to be contaminated. Reindeer meat in Lapland, a region above the Arctic Circle and extending over northern Norway. Sweden, Finland, and Russia, was declared unfit for human consumption, also due to radioactive contamination. And for a time, fresh meat from Eastern Europe was banned by the EC, European Community. After the accident, some experts predicted disastrous long-term effects, estimating that between 6,500 and 45,000 people could die as a result of cancer caused by exposure to radiation. But a report issued by the World Health Organization, WHO, in 2000 concluded that there is no evidence of a major public health impact attributable to radiation exposure 14 years after the accident. There is no scientific evidence of increases in overall cancer incidence or mortality or in non-malignant disorders that could be related to radiation exposure. Since the type of nuclear power plant, called RMBK, in use in the former Soviet Union is no longer in operation elsewhere in the world, non-Soviet scientists had few lessons to learn from the event. One American nuclear expert remarked that most of the lessons from Chernobyl have been learned already and applied in the United States. However, opinion remained divided over the relative safety of nuclear power in general.
Who was Carrie Nation?
The Kentucky-born Carrie Nation, 1846 to 1911, became famous as a temperance agitator in the early 1900s. The saloon was illegal in her resident state of Kansas, and she felt it was her divine duty to take her hatchet to ruining any place that sold intoxicants. Between 1899 and 1909, she went on wrecking expeditions, which she called hatchetations, throughout the state, incurring the wrath of business owners and government officials. Though many might have favored national prohibition of alcohol, Nation's actions were extreme to say the least, causing her to be arrested, imprisoned 30 times, and even shot at. She persisted, however, buoyed by the belief that she was performing a public and even divine service. The propitiously named Carrie A. Nation, who tried, it seems, to carry the nation straight to the water fountain, did not live to see prohibition made into a national policy in 1917 nor to see it revoked in 1933.
When did Martin Luther King Jr. give his "I Have a Dream" speech?
The occasion was the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. That summer day more than a quarter million people lobbying for congressional passage of a civil rights bill gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to hear speakers, including the charismatic and influential King, 1929 to 1968. His eloquent words define the movement and still inspire those who continue to work for reforms. Among his words were these: "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Congress did pass the Civil Rights Act, in 1964. The most comprehensive American civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction, the 12-year period that followed the Civil War. The act outlawed racial discrimination in public places, assured equal voting standards for all citizens, prohibited employer and union racial discrimination, and called for equality in education.
What is the history of the Ku Klux Klan?
The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, is a white supremacist group originally formed in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. When Confederate Army veterans formed what they called a social club. The first leader, called the Grand Wizard, was Nathan Bedford Forrest, 1821–1877. A former general in the Confederate Army, who, on April 12, 1864, in the final days of the Civil War, led a massacre of 300 black soldiers in service of the Union Army at Fort Pillow, Tennessee. As the unofficial arm of resistance against Republican efforts to restore the nation and make full citizens of its black, formerly slave, population, the Ku Klux Klan waged a campaign of terror against blacks in the South during Reconstruction. 1865–77, the 12-year period of rebuilding that followed the Civil War. Klan members, cloaked in robes and hoods to disguise their identity, threatened, beat, and killed numerous blacks, while the group deprived its victims of their rights as citizens. Their intent was also to intimidate the entire black population and keep them out of politics. White people who supported the federal government's measures to extend rights to all black citizens also became the victims of the fearsome Klan. Membership in the group grew quickly, and the Ku Klux Klan soon had a presence throughout the South. In 1871 the U.S. Congress passed the Force Bill, giving President Ulysses S. Grant, 1822–1885, authority to direct federal troops against the Klan. The action was successful, causing the group to disappear but only for a time. In 1915 the society was newly organized at Stone Mountain, Georgia, as a Protestant fraternal organization, called the Invisible Empire, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan Incorporated. This time widening its focus of persecution to include Roman Catholics, immigrants, and Jews, as well as blacks. Members of all of these groups became the target of KKK harassment, which now included torture, whippings, and public lynchings. The group, which proclaimed its mission of racial purity, grew in number and became national, electing its own to public office in many states, not just the South. But the society's acts of violence raised the public ire, and by the 1940s, America's attention focused on World War II, 1939–45, and the Klan died out or went completely underground. The group had another resurgence during the 1950s and into the early 1970s. As the nation struggled through the era of civil rights, the Klan still exists today, fostering the extremist views of its membership, and staging marches to demonstrate its presence on the American landscape. Such demonstrations are often attended by protesters,
What was the impact of the accident at 3 Mile Island?
Prior to the March 1979 events at 3 Mile Island, it was thought that the danger of a nuclear meltdown was almost negligible. Though there were safety systems in place, none of them would have prevented a complete catastrophe. Since the accident, the American Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, and utility companies have worked together to resolve the problems that were revealed. Among the efforts and requirements put into place were more stringent licensing procedures for operators, better training of plant operators in the event of an emergency, wider sharing of information on emergency management systems, effort to locate new plants outside of densely populated areas, more rigid quality assurance standards at all plants, strict implementation of the standards, which are subject to review by the NRC, and emergency evacuation plans that must be approved by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Even with these improvements to safety programs, the accident at Chernobyl in 1986 again produced worldwide concern over the hazards of nuclear power.
What have been the deadliest tropical storms in the world?
The deadliest tropical storms are not hurricanes but rather the unnamed supercyclones that sweep out of the Bay of Bengal. In the Indian Ocean, striking the densely populated Indian subcontinent. These storms have been known to kill 100,000 people or more. The fatalities numbered more than 300,000 when a 1970 cyclone struck East Pakistan, Bangladesh. That storm is still the deadliest cyclone to hit the region. But more recent Indian cyclones, which usually occur in April through June and September through November, have sometimes reached supercyclone status. An April 1991 storm packing 160-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves swept over Bangladesh's low-lying coastal plain. There was no place for residents to seek shelter from the advancing sea. An estimated 140,000 people perished and 10 million were left homeless. Property damage climbed to more than $2 billion. In October 1999, another devastating cyclone struck the Bay of Bengal region. It was the strongest and deadliest since the 1991 disaster. 10,000 died and more than 1 million people lost their homes.
What happened in the blackout of 2003?
A 3-month investigation found that line failures and system errors combined to cause the power outage that hit much of the Northeast and Great Lakes portions of the United States, as well as parts of eastern Canada. On August 14, 2003, the blackout affected 50 million people, 40 million of them in the United States. A task force headed by the U.S. Department of Energy and its Canadian counterparts delved into the sequence of events that caused the massive power failure. Investigators concluded that mistakes made by First Energy Corporation of Akron, Ohio, had combined with heavy loads of power to stress the interstate electrical grid and cause its failure through a chain reaction. Just after 4 p.m. EDT. On Friday, August 14, power was knocked out from Detroit to Toronto to New York City. The widespread outage immediately affected water supplies, halted air transportation and subway systems, snarled ground transportation, and brought most distribution lines to a standstill, affecting the flow of food and other supplies. Though there were isolated reports of looting, crime was minimal, with New York City reporting a lower crime rate for the night of August 14 than usual. 8 deaths were related to the blackout. Power began to be restored to some areas later that evening, but it was August 16 before all affected areas were back online. 2 weeks later, on August 28, London experienced a blackout at the peak of evening rush hour. The outage paralyzed the British capital and left 500,000 commuters stranded. Power was restored within an hour. A utilities official said that the freak event was caused by 2 faults that happened in quick succession. In late September 2003 there were also widespread power outages in Denmark, Sweden, and Italy. The blackout in Italy affected the entire nation, with the exception of Sardinia, or 57 million people. Because it happened overnight and on a weekend, the impact was minimal. The blackouts drew attention to the need for system upgrades, improved maintenance, and more sophisticated alert systems to prevent such grid failures, which take both an economic and human toll.
What were the harshest blizzards to hit the United States?
Regions of the United States, particularly the Great Plains, Midwest, and New England, typically experience extreme winter weather, but some storms do stand out. In March 1888 the Northeast was hit by a blizzard dubbed the Great White Hurricane. After a warm spell that had caused the buds to open on trees in New York's Central Park. On March 12 the temperature in the city plummeted to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds off the Atlantic built up to 48 miles per hour, bringing unpredicted snow that continued intermittently until the early morning of March 14. The 3-day accumulation totaled 20.9 inches, and snowdrifts 15 to 20 feet high halted traffic. The snowfall was even greater elsewhere, averaging 40 inches or more in parts of southeastern New York and southern New England. The storm extended down into Chesapeake Bay, isolating the nation's capital from the world for more than a day. 200 ships were lost or grounded, and at least 100 died at sea. A total of at least 400 people died, half of them in New York City alone. Just 2 months before this nor'easter, another blizzard had swept through the Great Plains, moving eastward into Minnesota. There, high winds, blowing snow, and sudden drops in temperature combined to make it a dangerous storm. killing many people and thousands of cattle. The Great Blizzard of 1993 caused loss of life and extensive damage all along the eastern seaboard, from Maine to Florida. More than 300 people died, almost 50 of them at sea, and economic losses totaled $3 to $6 billion. While several so-called 100-year storms have bombarded the East Coast in the 1990s alone, there had been another just a few months earlier, in December 1992. The statistics of the March 1993 storm are impressive indeed, probably qualifying it as the storm of the century. Wind gusts exceeded 75 miles per hour all along the East Coast, with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour were measured at various points, including Flat Top, North Carolina. Tennessee saw the highest snowfall of the storm, with 56 inches at Mount LeConte. Snowfall amounts were also heavy in the Northeast, but snow accumulated as far south as the Florida Panhandle. Experts estimated that the amount of water that fell, in the form of snow, was equivalent to 40 days' flow of the mighty Mississippi River past New Orleans. According to record low barometer readings, this storm surpassed Hurricanes Hugo, 1989, and Hazel, 1954. However, Midwesterners and residents of the northern Great Plains could argue that storms such as the Great Blizzard of 1993 are relatively common in their regions. To wit, another storm that could easily vie for the title storm of the century occurred January 10 to 11, 1975. In the upper Midwest, the blizzard was accompanied by winds of 90 miles per hour and wind chills as low as -80 degrees Fahrenheit. Trains were stranded in snowdrifts, and at least 80 people died. Ranchers and farmers were hard hit, losing some 55,000 head of livestock.
What is the worst flood in history?
The worst flood to date occurred in China in 1887, when more than 900,000 people died as the Huanghe Yellow River overflowed. China is particularly susceptible to severe and regular flooding. The Huanghe River alone typically floods 2 out of every 3 years. And because river valleys are densely populated, the human toll is often great. A 1939 flood in North China claimed more than 500,000 lives.
When did the American suffragist movement begin?
In the 1840s, American women began organizing and, in increasing numbers, demanding the right to vote. The movement was started by women who sought social reforms, including outlawing slavery, instituting a national policy of temperance, abstinence from alcoholic beverages, and securing better work opportunities and pay. These reformers soon realized that in order to make change they needed the power of the vote. Among the leaders of the suffragist movement was feminist and reformer Elizabeth Cady Stanton, 1815 to 1902. She joined with anti-slavery activist Lucretia Mott, 1793 to 1880, to organize the first women's rights convention in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, launching the woman suffragist movement. In 1869 Stanton teamed with Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1906, to organize the National Woman Suffrage Association. That same year, another group was formed, the American Woman Suffrage Association. Led by women's rights and anti-slavery activist Lucy Stone, 1818 to 1893, and her husband Henry Brown Blackwell, 1825 to 1909. In 1870 the common cause of the two groups was strengthened by the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave all men, regardless of race, the right to vote. When the two organizations joined forces in 1890, they formed the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA. The founders of the American women's movement were followed by a new generation of leaders, which included Stanton's daughter, Harriet Eaton Blatch, 1856 to 1940, as well as Alice Paul, 1885 to 1977, who founded the organization that became the National Woman's Party. An organizer and editor Lucy Burns, 1879 to 1966, who worked closely with Paul. The suffragists appealed to middle-class and working-class women, as well as to students and radicals. They waged campaigns at the state level, distributed literature, organized meetings, made speeches, and marched in parades. They also lobbied federal legislators, picketed, and chained themselves to the White House fence. When jailed, many resorted to hunger strikes and were sometimes met with cruel treatment. The suffragists' fight was a fierce one. The opposition played on the widespread belief that if given the right to vote, women would neglect the traditional duties of wife and mother. The movement gained strength during World War I, 1914-18. As men went off to fight the war in Europe, the women at home demonstrated themselves to be intelligent and involved citizens in the life of the country. A wartime suffragist poster declared in one long column, as a war measure, "The country is asking of women service as farmers, mechanics, nurses, doctors, munitions workers, mine workers, yeomen, gas makers, bellboys, messengers, conductors, motormen, army cooks, telegraphers, ambulance drivers, advisors to the Council of National Defense," and in another short column it stated, "as a war measure. Women are asking of the country, the vote." By 1918 support for women's suffrage was broad. That year Congress proposed a constitutional amendment stating that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It was passed, as the proposed 19th Amendment, in the House in 1918 and in the Senate in 1919. The amendment was approved by the required number of state legislatures on August 18, 1920, when Tennessee ratified it.
Has a tsunami ever hit the United States?
Yes, in fact the tallest tsunami ever recorded hit Alaska in 1964, it was 220 feet high. The March 28 event was brought on by an earthquake, the Great Alaskan Earthquake in Prince William Sound, measuring 9.2 on the Richter scale. The seismic wave, tsunami, hit the southwest part of the state and claimed 107 lives. Hawaii also sees an occasional tsunami, or giant wave. Though the most remarkable one hit the islands before they became a state. On April 1, 1946, all of the water drained from the 3-mile-wide harbor at Hilo, which was immediately followed by a tsunami that rushed on shore, destroying the waterfront. The process repeated itself twice and resulted in the death of more than 150 people in Hawaii.
What are reparations?
Reparations are payments or other compensations made to a group of people who have been wronged or injured. The issue was in the news in the 1990s and early 2000s as lawmakers, academics, and other leaders pressed for a redress for slavery, which some scholars call the American, or Black, Holocaust. The precedents for making reparations were several. The German government made reparations to survivors and families of victims of the Nazi Holocaust. And the American government made reparations to Japanese Americans who had been interned during World War II. 1939-45, as well as to Native Americans, for damages done to them. The recent discussion of reparations began in 1989, when U.S. Representative John Conyers, Michigan, introduced a bill, H.R. 40, in Congress to establish a commission to examine the institution of slavery, and economic discrimination against African Americans and, if so determined, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies. As the idea of reparations gained currency in the American public in the 1990s, supporters argued that redress for slavery would help heal the open wound of race relations and would compensate the descendants of slaves whose ancestors' work had helped build the national economy. They further argued that slavery resulted in long-term discrimination that beleaguered Black Americans. They were the victims of a centuries-old government-sanctioned system that established a legacy of race-based injustices. African-American activist and author Randall Robinson explained it this way: no nation can enslave a group of people for hundreds of years, set them free bedraggled and penniless to pit them without assistance, in a hostile environment against privileged victimizers, and then reasonably expect the gap between the ears of the two groups to narrow. Lines begun parallel and left alone can never touch. In bolstering support for reparations, Robinson pointed to the consequences of this massive injustice that blacks in the United States experience high rates of infant mortality, low incomes, high rates of unemployment, substandard education, high death rates. below average lifespans, and overrepresentation in prisons and on death row. Critics of reparations said that compensating the descendants of slaves was unrealistic. Determining who would be paid would alone constitute an expensive government program. They also questioned why descendants of slaves should be paid by the government a century and a half after the end of the brutal system. Further, they argued that other programs, born of the civil rights movement, have strived to bring equity to African Americans. Despite criticism, Representative Conyers resolved to reintroduce his bill as often as necessary until Congress would act on it. He emphasized that his goal was to create a commission, informed by town hall meetings, to first determine if there should be reparations and if so, who should be paid and how much. H.R. 40 had received the support of the city councils of Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and Atlanta.
What were the effects of the Dust Bowl?
After the dust had settled in the spring of 1934, the reaction among many Great Plains farm families was to flee the devastation. More than 350,000 people packed up their belongings and headed west, their lives forever changed by the disaster. In his 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath, American writer and Nobel laureate John Steinbeck, 1902 to 1968, chronicled the harrowing and sorrowful westward journey of one Oklahoma family that was among the so-called Okies who deserted their farmlands in the devastated area of the Great Plains in search of a better life elsewhere. Nature alone was not to blame for the Dust Bowl. By the end of the 19th century, farmers, aided by the advent of large tractors and reapers, harvesting machines, were cultivating the Great Plains, uprooting the native buffalo grass, which holds moisture in the soil, keeping it from blowing away. Even strong winds and extended droughts had not disturbed the land when it was covered by the grassland. When the demand for wheat increased after World War I, 1914-18, farmers responded by planting more than 27 million new acres of the grain. By 1930 there were almost 3 times as many acres in wheat production as 10 years earlier. Most of the buffalo grass that had prevented the earth from blowing had been removed. When the next dry period came, in spring 1934, and the wind picked up, the Dust Bowl resulted. The government stepped in to remedy the problem. Soil conservation became the focus of federal agencies, and the U.S. Forest Service undertook a project to plant a shelter belt of trees within a 100-mile wide zone, from Canada to the Texas Panhandle. Recovery was aided by the return of the rains. Soon the buffalo grass had grown back, helping to ensure that the Dust Bowl would not recur.
What was the nonviolence movement?
The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. 1929 to 1968, was committed to bringing about change by staging peaceful protests. He led a campaign of nonviolence as part of the civil rights movement. King rose to prominence as a leader during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, when he delivered a speech that embodied his Christian beliefs and set the tone for the nonviolence movement, saying, "We are not here advocating violence. The only weapon we have is the weapon of protest." Throughout his life, King staunchly adhered to these beliefs even after terrorists bombed his family's home. King's arsenal of democratic protest included boycotts, marches. The words of his stirring speeches, comprising an impressive body of oratory, and sit-ins. With other African American ministers, King established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. 1957, which assumed a leadership role during the civil rights movement. The nonviolent protest of Black Americans proved a powerful weapon against segregation and discrimination. A massive demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963 helped sway public opinion and motivate lawmakers in Washington to act when news coverage of the event showed peaceful protesters being subdued by policemen using dogs and heavy fire hoses. In response to the outcry over the event in Birmingham, President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, proposed civil rights legislation to Congress. The bill was passed in 1964. That same year, Martin Luther King Jr. received the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent activism. King's policy of peace was challenged 2 years later when the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, tired of the violent response with which peaceful protesters were often met, urged activists to adopt a more decisive and aggressive stance and began promoting the slogan Black Power. The civil rights movement, having made critical strides, became fragmented, as leaders, including the highly influential Malcolm X, 1925 to 1965, differed over how to effect change. On April 4, 1968, King was in Memphis, Tennessee, to show his support for a strike of black sanitation workers when he was gunned down outside his hotel room shortly after 5:30 in the evening. As news of King's death swept over the nation, blacks in 168 American cities and towns responded with rioting, setting fire to buildings, and looting white businesses. Commenting on the terror, radical African American leader Stokely Carmichael said, "When white America killed Dr. King last night, she declared war on us." The chaos continued for a week. When the rioting ended on April 11, there were 46 dead, most of them black, 35,000 injured, and 20,000 jailed. Nevertheless, the violent crime that claimed the leader's life and the violence that erupted after news spread of his death have not, decades later, overshadowed King's legacy of peace and his message of the brotherhood of all people.
What happened at 3 Mile Island?
The March 1979 accident, a near meltdown at the nuclear power station at 3 Mile Island, outside Middletown, Pennsylvania, near Harrisburg, was eventually contained. Had it not been, the damage would have been on a level with that of the Chernobyl, Ukraine, disaster, which happened some 7 years later. Instead, 3 Mile Island served as a wake-up call, reminding the American public and its utility companies of the potential risks involved in nuclear energy. The sequence of events at the nuclear power plant, which is located on an island in the Susquehanna River, was as follows. At 4 a.m. on Wednesday, March 28, an overheated reactor in Unit 2 of the power plant shut down automatically, as it should have. Metropolitan Edison Company operators, guided by indicators that led them to believe water pressure was building, and an explosion was therefore imminent, shut down those pumps that were still operating. The shutdown of all the pumps caused the reactor to heat further. Then, tons of water poured out through a valve that was stuck open. This water overflowed into an auxiliary building through another valve that was mistakenly left open. This final procedure, which took place at 4:38 a.m., released radioactivity. Since there was no cooling system in operation, the reactor in Unit 2 was damaged. But this was not the end of it. The radiation within the buildings was released into the atmosphere. And at 6:50 a.m. a general emergency was declared. Early that afternoon, the hydrogen being created by the uncovered reactor core accumulated in a containment building and exploded. Since hydrogen continued to be emitted, officials feared another catastrophic explosion. Worse yet, they feared the reactor would become so hot that it would melt down. The effect of a meltdown would be that the superheated material would eat its way through the bottom of the plant and bore through the ground until it hit water, turning the water into high-pressure steam, which would erupt, spewing radioactivity into the air. As technicians worked to manage the crisis, radiation leaked into the atmosphere off and on through Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday, the governor of Pennsylvania ordered an evacuation. Some 144,000 people were moved from the Middletown area. The situation inside the plant remained tenuous as a hydrogen bubble developed and increased in size, again raising fear of explosion. Meantime, public alarm was mounting as the media attempted to monitor the ongoing crisis. Finally, on Sunday, April 1, the plant was visited by President Jimmy Carter, 1924. At about the same time, the hydrogen bubble began to decrease in size, ending the crisis.
How long have hurricanes been given names?
The practice of naming hurricanes has a long history. According to the National Hurricane Center, for hundreds of years Caribbean storms were named according to the saint whose liturgical day it was when the storm hit. This became confusing when hurricanes struck on the same day but in different years. leading to such references as Hurricane San Felipe II. During World War II, the U.S. military began naming storms, giving them women's names. In 1951, the American Weather Services began naming Atlantic Ocean storms according to a phonetic alphabet: Abel, Baker, Charlie, etc. Just a few years later, forecasters returned to using women's names, and a new list of names was created for each Atlantic hurricane season, June 1 to November 30. Storms in some areas of the Pacific began being named in 1959, and by 1964, all regions of the Pacific were using the naming convention. For each year, there is a list for each region of the world where tropical cyclones occur: Atlantic, Eastern North Pacific, Central North Pacific, Western North Pacific, etc. The lists of names are agreed upon at international meetings of the World Meteorological Association. Establishing names for storms helps meteorologists track more than one storm at any given time. Makes clear the communication of warnings, and facilitates study, since the names of major hurricanes are retired to avoid confusion later. In 1979, equality was brought to the naming process, introducing men's names as well as multicultural names to each season's list. Since each season's storms are named in alphabetical order, there is a preponderance of storms beginning with the letters A, B, and C. However, in 1995, Hurricane Opal ravaged the Florida Panhandle. Not since forecasters began naming hurricanes had they reached the letter O. The letters Q, U, X, Y, and Z are not used because there are so few names beginning with those letters.
What was the Night of Terror?
It is a little-known episode in the American suffragist movement that took place on November 14, 1917, at the Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. After President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, took office in January 1917, activists began picketing daily outside the White House, demanding the right to vote for women. It was the first time in history that demonstrators had marched at the White House. The suffragists carried banners that read, "Mr.
How long have people been getting sick?
Humankind has suffered from illnesses since humans first appeared on Earth millions of years ago. But in the absence of medical knowledge, which only began about 5,000 years ago, ailments and sickness were assumed to have been brought on by angered gods or evil spirits. Even today, some primitive groups believe they must appease the gods and spirits through offerings and sacrifices in order to stave off or rid themselves of illness. These are practices carried out by witch doctors or healers. In prehistoric times, such superstitious beliefs resulted in the first medical procedure. in which a hole was drilled into the patient's skull. This practice was believed to allow evil spirits to escape the body and thereby rid the body of sickness. Fossil findings showing this method of treatment date back about 10,000 years. One vestige of ancient treatments of illness that still has relevance today is the use of plants and plant substances for medicinal purposes.
What were the freedom rides?
The Freedom Rides were a series of bus rides designed to test the U.S. Supreme Court's prohibition of segregation in interstate travel. In 1960, in the case of Boynton v. Virginia, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of a Howard University student who charged that segregation laws at the Richmond, Virginia, bus station violated federal anti-segregation laws. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, decided to test the enforcement of the federal law by initiating the Freedom Rides. On May 4, 1961, 13 people, black and white, boarded a bus for the South. Meant as a nonviolent means of protest against local segregation laws. The riders were nevertheless met with violence when the bus reached Montgomery, Alabama. On May 20, a white mob was waiting, the Freedom Riders were beaten. Rioting broke out in the city, and U.S. Marshals were sent to restore order. The interracial campaign to desegregate transportation was ultimately successful. But government intervention was required to enforce the laws, as numerous Southern whites had demonstrated that they weren't going to comply voluntarily.
What was the impact of the fire at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas?
The November 21, 1980, blaze, which killed 85 people and injured more than 600, led to a nationwide revision of local fire codes, giving the tragic event large-scale political significance. The MGM Grand Hotel had, in fact, passed fire inspections, but the building, which was then the world's largest gambling casino, had been 8 years in the making. Between the time it was designed, fire protection systems included, and the time it was built, the building no longer complied with the always improving safety standard for high-rise buildings. A short circuit started the blaze, which sent thick black smoke through the air ducts and escape stairwells. In the 21 floors of guest rooms, since more people were harmed or killed by smoke inhalation than by the fire itself, the American public became aware of the danger of smoke over and above that of fire. The event was a catalyst for change. Prior to the November blaze, most communities had not required existing buildings to be retrofitted every time fire safety codes changed and improved. After the fire, many communities chose to require building owners to comply with current protection capabilities.
How much damage was done by the Great Fire of London?
The fire, which began early in the morning on Sunday, September 2, 1666, and burned for 4 days and nights, consumed 4/5 of the city, which was then walled, plus 63 acres lying just outside the city walls. The blaze began in Pudding Lane near London Bridge and quickly spread through crowded wooden houses to the Thames Wharf warehouses. The destruction included London's Guildhall, the Custom House, the Royal Exchange, and St. Paul's Cathedral. Additionally, 44 livery company halls, 86 churches, and more than 13,000 houses were destroyed. Though the fire was unquestionably disastrous, London soon rebuilt and became one of Europe's most modern cities. The fire also destroyed thousands of old buildings where lice-infested rats had lived. They were partly responsible for spreading the plague through the English city.